So I saw a headline this week that said that movie theaters across the country are rescreening The Never-Ending Story in celebration of its 40th anniversary. And if you're old enough to remember when The Never-Ending Story came out originally, then, it's probably time for some medical checkups for you and all of that. I'm one of those people. I can remember when this story came out. Some of you are not old enough to remember The Never-Ending Story, so you're not going to understand what all the fuss is about. But for those of you who remember in 1984, when this fantasy film hit theaters, you have a once-in-a-lifetime, well, it's your second time in a lifetime, I guess. You have another chance in a lifetime right now, today, tomorrow, or Tuesday, to go to the theater and see Falkor the Luck Dragon, as well as Atreyu and Artax and all of the other characters from this story on the big screen again. But do not expect to find me at the theater watching this movie with you, because I need to admit to you that the villain from this story, this werewolf character called the Gamork, was the star of my nightmares my entire childhood. I'm telling you, like, this thing, in my imagination, this thing lived in my bedroom, you know? And so when I put my head down on the pillow at night and like wrapped the cover over my head, it's because I was afraid that guy was going to find me, you know? And so I'm not going to watch this show again. In fact, I've had some words with my parents at this point about why they allowed me to watch this show when I was a child, why they allowed me to watch this show multiple times when I was a child, and I kind of have some frustration and concern with myself about why I kept watching it when I knew that it was terrifying. But isn't it odd, some of the stories that we choose to tell to our children? I don't know if you've ever given this any thought, if you've ever really given any consideration to some of the fables and the fairy tales that have been told to children in the West for centuries, but have you ever wondered what the authors were thinking when they called these children's stories? I mean, think about the story of Rumpelstiltskin. You remember this? It's the story of a distraught young woman who's going to be executed unless she magically turns a room full of hay into gold, and then she makes a deal with a goblin who turns the straw into gold but demands to receive her firstborn child unless she can guess his name within 3 days. What are the authors thinking, trying to tell these stories to kids, you know? Or here's another one. You remember the story of Hansel and Gretel? This one's a charmer. It's the story of two impoverished, poor, starving siblings whose stepmother intentionally abandons them in the forest, where they stumble upon a candy house inhabited by a cannibalistic witch who almost succeeds in her plan to cook and eat the children, except that they beat her to the punch and murder her first. What are the authors thinking when they tell these stories to the children? I don't know about you, but every detail of those sounds terrifying to me. But for over 200 years, despite my objections, we've been telling these stories to the kids. But it doesn't just happen with our fairy tales. It doesn't just happen with our fables. Sometimes the objectionable stories that we share with our children come straight from the pages of the Bible, which is precisely what happened to me with the story that we're discussing today. We're wrapping up a weeks-long series of messages that's been bringing us through the summer. It's called Flannel Graph Favorites. And what we've been doing this summer is taking a deeper look at some of the Old Testament stories that those of us who were fortunate to grow up in church might have learned from our Sunday school teachers. And so today, we're re-examining one of the most notorious of all the Sunday school lessons. It's one that I distinctly remember being taught when I was a child. This is the story of Samson. Now, I need to let you know that in my Sunday school experience, all of my teachers were very prim and proper ladies of the church. I mean, ladies that you would hold up as people who were very respectful and wise and appropriate, which is why I'm surprised they thought to teach me the story of Samson. I mean, if you read the story of Samson, you'll discover quickly that Samson was a promiscuous womanizer who totally ignored God's plans for his life. He had no desire, no interest in trying to do what God had outlined for him to do. It's a weird story to tell to the kids. But as adults, maybe it's a story we need to hear. If you got your Bible with you this morning, I'd be thrilled for you to join me in Judges chapter 13. You can use the Heritage app on your Bible as well, and it'll take you, Heritage app on your phone, it'll take you straight to that passage in the Bible app. But while you're finding your way there, let me fill you in on some of the background that you need to know about the book of Judges. You need to know that everything that happens in this book happens in the period of Israel's history after they have already been rescued from slavery in Egypt, after they have been guided by the Lord through the wilderness, and after they've been led and entered into the promised land, the land that had been promised to their ancestors long ago. But when they got to the promised land was not empty of people. There were folks who were living there, and so God used Israel, along with their leader Joshua, to force out some of the wicked, idol-worshiping, child-sacrificing cultures and civilizations that were living in Canaan at that time. God was carrying out a righteous judgment against some of those people and for the way that they were worshiping their false gods and sacrificing their children to these false gods. And so the Israelites take possession of the land that God had promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but they didn't follow the instruction to eradicate all of the tribes. And so as time went on, Israel began to look more and more like the tribes that they were living in proximity with. They forgot about God's history. They forgot about God's provision. They forgot about God's protection in the past, and they started allowing themselves to be influenced by and integrated with some of the religious practices of their neighbors. In fact, Judges chapter 2 puts it this way. It says, after that whole generation that moved into the promised land had been gathered to their ancestors, or after they died, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what the Lord had done for Israel. And then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals. They served the foreign gods of their neighbors. Verse 12 says they forsook the Lord. They turned their back on God, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths, these other foreign gods from their neighboring cultures. And verse 14 says that God, in his anger against Israel, gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. God sold them into the hands of their enemies all around whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. So here's what's happening. This is a really good summary of the context of the book of Judges, but Israel has forgotten who they are. Israel has forgotten what they've been through, what they've been carried through. Israel has forgotten where they've come from. Israel has forgotten their covenant with God and turned their attention to the manufactured gods of the cultures that are around them. They have ignored God's instruction, God's covenant, God's law, and they have placed their trust elsewhere. And so God does what God has been promising that he would do in a situation like this. He allows them to make their own choice. He allows them to choose to move forward without his protection, to make the decision to walk away from the covenant that they've made and to experience the consequences of trying to live without God's protection. And so it ends up that Israel is attacked and conquered by other tribes. But what happens over and over and over again in Judges is that Israel gets conquered and enslaved by some other nation, some other tribe nearby, and then Israel would remember their God Then Israel would remember to cry to God for help. And as soon as they did that, God would come swooping in and rescue them from their oppressors. In fact, this is the pattern in Judges that happens time and time again. It's a pattern of disobedience, followed by disaster, followed by deliverance. Okay, so every time the Israelites choose to walk away from God and do everything on their own because they know better, they know how to take care of themselves, then they experience disaster, then they ask God to come help, and God provides deliverance until the next time that Israel decides to walk away. This is the pattern that happens time and time again. But the reason this book is called Judges is because in most of the cases when God provides deliverance, it happens by God raising up a new leader, one that would be called a judge. It doesn't look like a courtroom scene like we're thinking, but someone who would be a ruler from within Israel, a catalyst for the deliverance that God is going to provide, a hero that God would use to save the day. The problem is, throughout Judges, the heroes, the judges, are not model citizens either. They're just as susceptible, if not more susceptible, to the kinds of arrogance and the kinds of unfaithfulness that Israel itself is prone to. And as time goes on, as one judge moves into the history part of the story and another judge emerges, the judges keep getting worse and worse. They're violent. They're arrogant. They don't act very heroic. And Samson, in this long line of judges who's getting worse and worse, Samson is the last one, the worst one. Now, his story is told in 4 chapters in the middle of Judges. It begins with a promise, and it's such a hopeful moment. Judges chapter 13, Israel's in the midst of one of those disobedient and disaster cycles. And Judges chapter 13, verse 1 says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. I mean, it's becoming a habit now, right? Again, the Israelites did what they've always been doing. It says, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. All right? Talking about that same pattern. Disobedience, disaster, deliverance. All right? The disobedience was ignoring God. The disaster was being handed over to the Philistines for 40 years. But then God sends a messenger to this Israelite couple, Manoah and his wife, and this couple has been unable to conceive a child, and God promises them that they're going to become pregnant. In fact, God tells them that this special son of theirs, Samson, is going to be an anointed leader, chosen from before he was born to help initiate the process of delivering Israel from the Philistines. This is going to be the new judge, the new hero, the new leader that God is going to use to help Israel escape, to receive deliverance from their captivity to the Philistines. And as a symbol of his anointing, his being chosen, Samson is instructed to live, through his parents, instructed to live his entire life according to the commitments that one would make when they take a Nazirite vow. Now, that's not familiar language to us, but if you look in Numbers chapter 6, you'll find instructions where if somebody wanted to go through a special season of commitment to God, they would say, God, I'm going to devote this season of my life to you, and they would follow some particular instructions. They would avoid alcohol, they would not ever get a haircut during that time, and they would avoid touching anything that was dead, whether that was a dead animal body or a dead human body. And so this is how Samson's parents bring him up. And they're delighted to have been part of this process. They're delighted to have been chosen, that the messenger of God came and spoke to them. And they made sure to raise Samson according to the guidelines, according to the commitments of the Nazirite vow. And he was blessed by God. But then he starts growing up, and he starts, in the midst of his growing up years, he starts exhibiting this almost superhuman strength. There would be moments when his life was in danger, moments when maybe he was attacked by a wild animal, and he would be overcome by the strength of God and have the ability to defend himself no matter what danger stood in his way. He had an incredible gift from the Lord, but Samson didn't have any inclination to use that gift for good. He didn't have any inclination to use that gift for God. In fact, as Samson got older, his life was simply marked by anger and violence. He used his strength just to hurt other people. He was never one to fight for the benefit of his brothers and sisters in Israel. He was never one to fight for God's will. He wasn't interested in the assignment that the messenger of God had told his parents would be his mission in life. He wasn't interested in rescuing Israel from Philistine oppression. He was interested in himself. Samson was controlled by lust. He was controlled by his own desires. In fact, his primary desire was Philistine women, which should have been off limits for him because God's instructions had told the people of Israel not to engage with the people who were around them worshiping other gods. But Samson didn't care anything about that. What Samson was interested in was himself. And so his love interests, combined with his hot, volatile temper, got him into all sorts of trouble in his adult life. And in chapter 14, Samson marries a young Philistine woman against his parents' objection. And in the course of their wedding celebration, Samson breaks most of the commitments of being a Nazirite. He ends up killing a lion and going back and interacting with the carcass later on, which is not something he's supposed to do. He's a part of this huge Philistine wedding celebration that takes days and days and days, and there's lots of alcohol there and all that kind of stuff. He's breaking all of the vows that he's supposed to be living by. But in the midst of all of that, he also makes a lot more enemies among the Philistines. And by the end of the wedding, by the end of the season of their wedding celebration, not only has he made a bunch of enemies with all of his wife's family's neighbors, but in the end, he ends up fighting, killing quite a few of them, and then in return, they come and kill his wife and his father-in-law, and they're looking for any opportunity they can to overpower Samson and to take him into captivity. It's a huge mess, which brings us to chapter 16, because in chapter 16, Samson becomes his worst enemy, his own worst enemy. In this chapter, he falls in love with another Philistine woman, a woman named Delilah. And we don't know if Delilah ever had any feelings for him at all, but what we do know is that the leaders of the Philistines saw this as an opportunity. And they met with Delilah in secret, and they promised that they would make her a rich woman if she would figure out the source of Samson's strength and help them to take him down. And so over the course of the next few verses in chapter 16, you can read the stories about how Samson leads her on and gives her misinformation and tries to skirt around the truth, but eventually Delilah has enough power over him, and his willpower is worn down such that he tells her the source of his strength, and it stems from his Nazirite vow and having never cut his hair. And so one night while Samson is sleeping, Delilah shaves Samson's head. And with that final violation of his lifelong Nazirite commitment to God, Samson's strength leaves him. In fact, the text tells us that when the Philistine leaders pounced upon him, he woke up from his sleep and he thought to himself, no big deal. I'll just handle this like I've handled it every other time I've ever been attacked. I'll just shake my way out of this, it won't be a problem. But the scripture says that Samson didn't know that the Lord had left him. He wasn't aware that all of the source of his strength that he had not appreciated or wanted to engage had been taken away. I want to tell you that when I learned this story in elementary school, when those sweet Bible class teachers at my home church taught me this story with the picture Bible that we were using, I don't know what they intended to teach me, but what I came away with was that Samson was a hero. I walked away thinking Samson was somebody to be imitated. thinking that Samson's strength was something that should be an example for all of us, that by God's power we could all take down lions, or we could use a donkey's jawbone to slay our enemies. That was the lesson that I took away. I imagined Samson as a hero of the faith. And now here I am, an adult, and I read this story of Samson and I think, what part of this story makes him a hero? What action did he ever take that we would expect a follower of Jesus to emulate? What is it about Samson that would make me think of him as a hero of the faith? I'm not sure I do anymore. I'm not sure I think of him as a hero, but it's funny how easy it is to slide into that. It's funny how, as humans, we have this tendency to minimize our hero's immorality. As humans, we have a propensity to just minimize our hero's indiscretions. I see this happening in the world around us a lot. We do this certainly with our political figures, our leaders, the ones that we hope would lead us. We have this uncanny ability to look past the indiscretions and the immoralities in someone's past when we have decided that we want them to be our hero. I see it happen in the church. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's too frequently in the news that there will be some preacher who has been elevated, held up as someone who is anointed by God, and yet their story is full of indiscretions and immoralities, and we tend to sweep those under the rug at times and act like they're no big deal. And I wonder about the stories that we're telling to our children. I wonder, when we teach the story of Samson, what's the story that we're trying to help our children understand? That this big, strong, long-haired man was somebody that should be an example for all of us? Or maybe that we should learn from the counterexample, that we should learn that his infidelity and that his lust and that his promiscuity and that his anger and that his violence were actually characteristics and habits that got in the way of carrying out God's will for his life. You know, what I want to do is to just treat Samson's story as a story of what not to do. I want to read Judges 13 through 16 and treat Samson as an anti-hero. And then I read Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 messes with me. You know, we just finished a series on Hebrews a few weeks back. And you might remember that Hebrews 11 is this chapter that's full of the list of names and some of the micro versions of the stories of some heroes of the faith. In fact, on the week that I preached Hebrews 11, I had about 30 of our church members of all ages stand up here on this top step, and they read Hebrews 11 in its entirety so that we could remember some of the stories of people like Abraham and Moses and Daniel, Rahab, and these other heroes whose faith inspires and has inspired followers of Jesus for centuries. But there's a part that trips me up. Because in Hebrews 11:32, the writer, as if running out of time, says, "What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, or Samson." He lists Samson in this chapter. And then he mentions a few other names, Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword. Now I'm listening to that list of all of those accomplishments, conquering kingdoms, escaping the sword, and I'm thinking not everybody on that list did everything on that list. So when you talk about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets, this is a general list and a general list of accomplishments. And Samuel didn't do all those things, and Samson certainly didn't do all those things. But there's this other little phrase. I don't have time to tell you about Samson, whose weakness was turned to strength. Man, there's a message. Because when I read the story of Samson, I see a lot of weakness. I see a lot of fault. I see a lot of bad decisions. I see a lot of arrogance. I see a lot of unfaithfulness. And when I read Hebrews 11, I imagine Samson stepping up to the microphone to tell you his story and saying, I didn't do any of it right. But by God's grace, my weakness was turned to strength. That's the kind of hero I want us to look to. The kind of hero who recognizes God's action and God's utilization of them in His plan. The kind of hero that looks to God and says, I'm not worthy of being a part of this story, but by God's grace, my weakness is being turned into strength. This is the kind of leader, this is the kind of hero that I hope I'll be. This is the kind of leader and hero that I hope you'll be. Is that as you look at your life and you recognize all the areas where you're not getting it right, you'll be able to say, but I want to submit my life to God so that my weaknesses can become strengths. You see, when we read Judges, and when we read the stories about all of these different characters and their downward decline, where just every judge was worse than the one before, we're not supposed to be reading these stories to find our heroes in these people. We're supposed to be reading these stories to understand God's faithfulness that makes willing people into heroes. You see, fulfilling God's promises begins with becoming God's person. If you're going to get to experience the fulfillment of God's promises in your story, and God has a plan for your story. Ephesians tells us that God has prepared from time long ago, God has prepared good works for us to do. God has a plan for the story of your life, but if you're going to be part of experiencing God's promises, it starts with becoming God's person. And I just wonder, what could Samson's story have been like if he had ever decided to submit his strength to the Lord? What could his story have turned out to be if he had ever said, God, use me? If he had ever cared about what God thought about who he spent his time with, or how he reacted to an offense, if he had ever thought to himself, these vows that the messenger from God asked me to keep, no alcohol, no cutting my hair, no touching dead stuff, if he had ever decided this stuff is important enough to me that I'm going to do it my whole life, there's no telling what his story might have been like. But he never decided to become God's person. And so he didn't get to see the complete fulfillment of God's purpose in his life. And it would take generations of more suffering and then more leadership being raised up before the Philistine occupation would finally be done away with. What would it be like if we decided to become persons of God? You see, God is not on the lookout for people who know how to be a hero on their own. But God's on the lookout for servants. God's on the lookout for people who, when they say, I'm a Christian, they think, I'm a little Christ. That's what they mean by that. I'm a little Christ. I'm one who is allowing the image of Christ to be formed in me. I am one who is conforming to the image of Jesus with my life. That's the story that I'm telling myself, and it's the story I'm telling my kids. I mean, what if your children knew that the story of your life was, I'm becoming God's person. I'm becoming a little Christ. I'm becoming one who is conformed to His image. You read Judges, you're not going to find a lot of human heroes and a lot of role models in there. That's not what these stories are recorded for. But what these stories can do is to help us imagine what's possible, to help us imagine what God has in mind when a human actually says, God, I want to partner with you. God, use my life, use my energy, use my time, use my resources, use my talents, use everything I am and everything that I have for your purposes. Just imagine how that story would turn out. I'm going to be praying for you this morning as we wrap up, that God would give you a spiritual imagination for that. That God would give you a spiritual imagination for the next steps in becoming God's person. Because that's where this whole process and promise begins. It begins with saying, God, I don't know how to run my life. God, I know that my appetites and my desires are not in tune with what you would have them be. I'm not wise enough to plot my own course, but I trust you. And I want to give you my life so that you can make it what it was intended to be.